Hello, and welcome to Life with God, a podcast where we explore key ideas in God through conversations with students and expert guests. As humans created in the image of God, we are called to reflect His character. But so many influences around us can leave us confused, broken, hurtful, and just longing for more. In Life with God, we seek to understand better the interdependent concepts of love, presence, power, beauty, freedom, justice, and truth by focusing on one concept at a time so that we learn healthy patterns of thought and behavior. We engage in this journey reflectively as followers of God who believe that a life with God is the best life we can live. We seek a relationship with God, and as we delve into this complex, unique, and fulfilling relationship, we invite you to come alongside and learn with us. Each season is a journey through 12 episodes. We first look at the concept from a combination of historical, psychological, philosophical, scientific, and artistic perspectives. Then, we delve into the Bible with 6 episodes focused on the Old Testament, the New Testament, and the entirety of Scripture. The season concludes with 3 episodes helping us grasp the implications of the concept in key relational contexts: family, community, and leadership. We hope that our discoveries will make us better human beings. And whether you are a Christian or not, we hope that you will join us in this space of conversation where you may find valuable insights to improve your self-image, your relationships, and, most importantly, your understanding of the divine. In Season 3, we study the concept of power in God, and our special guest in Episode 11 is Stacie Hatfield, Behavioral Sciences Program Director and Assistant Professor of Anthropology at Andrews University in Berrien Springs, Michigan. We are also joined by Beersheba Maywald, Erik Aepler, Ingrid Dumitrescu, and Juan Sanchez. I am your host, Adelina, and as always, I am very grateful for this conversation. Before we go into the discussion, we will take 5 minutes to get to know our guest through a speed round of questions. What are some of your favorite ways of spending time alone?
Oh, favorite ways of spending time alone. I am a people person, but it turns out that in order to be a people person, I also need some time to recharge. So favorite ways of spending time alone, I like to backpack, I like to walk, I like to be outside. Although when I was growing up, we didn't have a television. My dad, partly because my dad felt like there just wasn't any, just worthy content, but also he just didn't like the noise. And so a bit of a guilty pleasure is if I just need to really relax, like it feels like such a treat to sit down and just watch a nice show on Netflix or watch something that feels very relaxing. So sometimes time alone, I'll turn on the TV for a few minutes and do a little relaxing that way too. But I love to be outside.
Nice. And could you share one moment, memorable moment in your childhood with us, either good or bad experience, something that is memorable to you?
A memorable event from my childhood. We traveled a lot when I was growing up. My dad is an electrical engineer, and we traveled a lot with his work. So though we lived overseas for about half of my growing up years, my family weren't missionaries or in the military. So that means that experience is a little bit different. So the first places that we lived were more on the French-Belgian border, then in Dunkirk in the North Atlantic, and it's right on the ocean, but very, very cloudy. And I think my mom had some depression during that time, and I have a younger sister who's about 2 years younger, so she had 2 small kids, and then we had a dog in an apartment, and my dad was gone a lot at work, and it felt just kind of gray and a little bit cold. And then our next spot that we moved after that was to Italy. We were in Toronto, just a little bit in the arch of the boot heel there. And I remember going to the beach, and Italy was warm and it was sunny. and the beach was warm. And I remember looking out, and there was this waves that were coming in, and there was this whole school of little dark fish that were in there. And I still keep geraniums in the house because I love the smell of geraniums, because we had geraniums in our house when we were in Italy when I was a child. And for I don't remember living on the French-Belgian border there being bad or being difficult. I remember seeing a beach during the summer covered with umbrellas. It was so beautiful, but mostly really gray and stormy. And just the warmth and the brightness of Italy was just, it felt like new life. And it was such a delightful thing that I always think of it as a really fond memory.
Okay, which season do you enjoy the most?
I love the changes in the seasons. I've lived in places where there weren't 4 seasons, and in Michigan and in most of the places I've lived in the United States, we have spring, and spring is such a relief after winter. And we have summer, which there's fun things to do in the summer. You get outside, and then the fall, there's like kind of a relief from the summer. The summer's been busy and it's been hot, and fall, finally things begin to turn. And then in the winter, there's some winter sports that are really lovely, and the snow can be beautiful. So I do like the turn of seasons, but I think overall, maybe my favorite is fall. It seems to, I don't know, with teaching, maybe that'll change. Maybe as I'm like, oh no, we're about to be in a really busy season. Maybe that'll change. But for the most part, I usually really enjoy when things begin to slow down a little bit, when the weather begins to turn and it begins to move toward fall.
What's the longest journey you have been on, and how do you what are your memories of it?
Oh, so lots of long journeys, but graduate school is a huge journey. Moving is a lot of a journey sometimes. But several years ago, our son hiked the Pacific Crest Trail, and that's a trail in the United States that runs from the U.S.-Mexico border north-south to the U.S.-Canada border. And it's over 2,000 miles. And he hiked most of it. But the year that he hiked in 2017, the state of Oregon, which is about 350 miles, maybe more, 370 miles of the trail, we had wildfires there. And it wasn't safe for him to be on the trail. And he had to come off. He couldn't hike. He had to go around and couldn't hike that section because there were fires behind him, and they would close the trail. And then there were fires coming ahead, and you can't hike faster than a fire. So you have to just get off the trail. So a couple of years after that, he talked our daughter and me into hiking Oregon with him. So we backpacked we started at the northern part of Oregon called Cascade Locks, a very beautiful part in the mountains there, along the Pacific Crest. So there's a mountain ridge that comes together, the kind of the plains of the United States, and then drops off. There's mountains and then drops off into the ocean there on the west coast. And the trail runs along the ridge. So very often you can look off to one side or off to the other side, and you can see how the landscape is just different. It's through the mountains. And so we backpacked for a month on the trail, and we walked for 320 miles, and it was just phenomenally beautiful. And there were places, Isaac, our son, said that there were places on the trail that were different than the other parts of the trail he had hiked, because you could look back. There were points that were so high, and in the morning when we were looking, the mist would be low, but the mountain peaks would be sticking up, and it was like a movie. You could say, oh wait, that's Mount Jefferson. Like a week and a half ago, we were by that mountain, and you couldn't imagine a trail. If you had said to me, okay, you're on this mountain, you need to get to the next mountain, I wouldn't have known what to do. But we had hiked that trail, and we had been on that mountain. Behind that, you could see the other mountain that we'd been on, and behind that, one more mountain where we'd started. And it was just incredible. And I'd never backpacked a long distance like that at all before. And now I'm just like, oh no, I've got to, anytime I can get my feet to the trail, it's amazing. So there's some incredible trails in Germany, and there's some incredible trails in Europe, and also I know New Zealand has a phenomenal trail as well. So there's some good hiking yet to be done.
How would you describe yourself in 3 words?
Well, my husband is sitting next to me, so I'll have to choose my words carefully. I am optimistic, generally pretty extroverted. I enjoy people. But also imperfect in lots of ways.
Thank you so much, Stacie. I am excited about the journey we're going to take in this conversation together on the topic of God as power in relation to understanding living together in the community. It's a complex topic. It can be heavy. I feel like we should have, honestly, I feel like we should have several seasons just on this particular relationship between power and community. But I think just having an incipient discussion, perhaps a perspective change would be helpful to give us some direction. I just thought about a question that I'm going to address, and I'll see what you do with it. It's, to me, it seems difficult, but hopefully it's relatable to you from your expertise. It's just something I'm struggling with quite a bit, and I'd like to understand better. Thinking about power structures in the community, right? Community is like where we share life together, where we do life together, and we have to negotiate how to do that. So my opening question is, what do you think should be some of the features or driving motors of creating power structures in community? If that makes any sense to you.
It's an important question. And as I've been thinking about this session, I have been thinking about that a lot. Social theorists theorize power a lot. We have several theorists, particularly we think about, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Pierre Bourdieu, who talked about social fields and social, how people are in relationship to each other, how we can conceptualize that. Most famous for his philosophies of power is Michel Foucault. And Foucault theorizes power, that it's his concepts of power are probably his most famous. He's most famous for his concepts of power. And Foucault's theorizing power from kind of a from a multiple perspective. This idea of top-down kinds of power, authority figures and authority institutions, particularly governments, governmentalities, and how they conceptualize citizenry and what is power constituted, but also diffuse kinds of power, the kind of power we have between each other. And we're familiar with this from our brothers and sisters, and always trying, are you a little bit better? Or your mom's favorite today? Or I can't believe you're wearing that. Or really, are we eating that at potluck today? These are diffuse kinds of power that happen between each other all the time. And Foucault theorizes power as something always present wherever things exist, and particularly wherever individuals exist, which made me especially contemplate, how do we conceptualize power with God? Because how do we even think about this idea of power? Is power a good thing? Is power a bad thing? Is it the use of power that's bad? Do we think about power in terms of only those actions that happen between one person and another? Or do we think about our policies and our organizational structures as forms of power? And then what does this mean in terms of a God who says all power has been given unto me, all authority, and a God who is all powerful? Because in my mind, I often conceptualize power as being negative, power over. And certainly when we think of God as being all powerful, he is, but we want to conceptualize God rather than a domineering, punishing God, but rather as a God who is almighty and who's able to bring justice, and who's able to call things into existence through his power. And so this is a different kind of way of like, what are we really talking about when we're talking about power? And to kind of get those terms worked through a little bit as we start, what do we really mean? I think when we look at the Genesis story, we often think of Genesis in terms of the origins of life on the planet. We think about plants coming into existence. We think about the terraforming. We think about God calling into existence animals, fish and birds and mammals. And then we think about the creation of humankind. And we kind of stop there. But God calls into being also this temporality of the Sabbath, but also this relationship. And I think that a lot of what comes out, we have at the very beginning just these couple people. We have Adam and Eve. But then through this procreative process, where we have children and grandchildren, and then we begin to have marriage, which brings together people who are not related by blood and puts them into relationship and into community with people who are related by blood, meaning that we always have people from, always being people from different groups, except in places where you have endogamy, where marriage just happens internally within the group. But you have people being brought in and being brought into this web of community. So then when you have relationship like this, you begin to be in a relationship of power. And God situates this originally when he talks with, when he gives Adam his roles. God is the creator God. And this is something that is brought about. We don't have any witnesses of that. Adam himself is not a witness to that. He understands this by authority, that God tells him, I made this, and he's able to see that. And then he's given authority over animals to rule. This is a power dynamic. So what is the power of God to call creation into existence? What is, and in a pre-sin sort of sense, what is power that has power over natural forces, and the ways that we think of those kinds of natural power. And Erik, as you're thinking about, in engineering, so much has often to do with power, right? But we're thinking about how do we use, whether it's mechanical, whether we're lifting or moving things, whether it's electrical, and whether we're causing things to go. But we have these kinds of more natural kinds of forces of power, and then we have interactive social kinds of power. We have authoritative kinds of power. So what are we talking about here, and how do we understand so often in a human context, we've experienced pain because of power, or we experience marginalization because of power, or we say something that, well, we really got the last word in there, and we ourselves exerted power in a way that we now feel guilty or ashamed of. And so then how do we conceptualize a power and a powerful God in a way that isn't also, how do we understand what does it mean? When if God is all powerful, then he could have stopped something bad from happening, why didn't he? And if he's all powerful, why didn't he? So I think power is a very, very complex topic. In social thought and theory, it's always tied to this idea of agency as well. How much autonomy does a person have, or do groups have? And that becomes then this tension between the power that's around us, or a person's ability to navigate, becomes a bit of a measure or a way to see this relationship, to see relationships of power. And so I think as a start, back to your question, Evelina, when we're talking about power and community, I think as a very start, for me, and this is as we're talking about why anthropology is so, I love it so much and why it's so helpful to me, is to always be aware, very much like Foucault says, that power is always present. And also in a way that God's power is always present. So when we're talking about community, to recognize that there's hardly ever a moment when there's not a dynamic of power happening, and to begin to be aware of that. And that way, when we can say, oh wait, somebody's voice is not being heard because there's a power dynamic that's happening here. Or I've laid out these chairs in such a way, the way this table is set up, a round table allows everyone to have a bit of an equal space, right? Where a long table with a head creates a bit of a power dynamic. There's a person with this head. So even our built spaces, our organized spaces, convey power dynamics and are laden with power. And I think in terms of community, it's really helpful to be able to recognize first that power is always present, and that we need to be able to talk about it.
I don't know if this is a good follow-up question, but it just kind of popped in my mind. How do Christians use anthropology compared to secular people? And I'm thinking, and I don't want to bring up the current situation with the political leaders, but it just kind of like popped in my head. What is the difference between how Christians use anthropology and how secular people use it?
Anthropology is an incredibly broad field. So anthropology has 4 primary subfields. Archaeology in the United States, archaeology is a subfield or a field within anthropology. In Europe, I think they're separate, but in the United States, archaeology is a subfield of anthropology, and that anthropology studies human culture. Linguistics is a subfield within anthropology, a major subfield. Physical or biological, I'll call it just physical anthropology, is a subfield within anthropology, and that is probably the most evolutionarily based of the anthropological subfields, in that it tackles the questions of human origins, and many primatologists are physical anthropologists. Forensics, many forensics people work in forensics are physical anthropologists, because they're looking at the study of human culture through the human form and the human body. and the history of the human body, the biological aspects of what it is to be human. And I'm a cultural anthropologist, so we study living cultures and what does it mean? What is the human experience? How is that defined? My theoretical approach is interpretive. That draws from a theorist, very, very famous in anthropology, Erik Aepler. And the idea that in order to understand what's happening in culture, you need to look closely, and you need to listen closely and to be embedded in what's happening, so that that really the people who are living and experiencing and embodying certain ways of being are going to have the most knowledge about what that is. So I'm a white woman, I'm cisgender, I'm married to a man. I'm 52 years old, so age-wise, that puts me in a particular demographic. I'm able-bodied. And so all of these things mean that I see the world in particular ways, or I'm conditioned to be seen by the world in particular ways. And so that gives me particular knowledge, but also means there are many, many things I don't have firsthand knowledge of. And so an interpretive approach means that if I want to know about someone's experience who is not myself, then it's not really helpful for me to sit around and think about it, although that may be helpful too, but mostly I have to ask them, what is your experience? How do you feel about this? How has this happened to you? What does this mean to you? And that becomes a more interpretive approach. So I'm interpretive in my theoretical approach, also critical in my theoretical approach. And that doesn't mean critical as in like trying to just pick it apart and always finding a problem. But from a social thought perspective, a critical approach means that you're compelled to cause good in the world. And that also means that you're very often attentive to the ways in which what isn't good is happening. And often that has to do with relationships of power. So when Adelina said, do you want to talk about power? I was like, oh, wow, yeah, there's a lot there, because I have quite a lot of theoretical background in trying to understand relationships of power. And how do we theorize those? How do we think about those? How do we see them at work? In the work that I do, I look at intersections of race and gender in the United States as some of the work that I've done. How do we look at white supremacy, or how do we look at white dominance? What are the everyday interactions of power in which that's maintained in the United States? And so that's a way of thinking about that. I don't know, there are not many anthropologists in Adventism. I only know of 3 or 4, maybe. I'm hoping to meet more all the time. And many of the anthropologists that we have in Adventism are archaeologists, because they're looking at biblical archaeology. So I am always eager to meet, someone else who's also looking at social thought and theory. We have more sociologists, I think, but looking at social thought and theory from a believer's perspective, because there are so many incredible insights, so many incredible insights that not only does the Bible have to offer, but that I can say, oh, now that I'm reading the story of so-and-so in the Bible, like I can see what's happening there that I wasn't able to see before. And I find it to be incredibly helpful. I think a difference from a secular sense is that anthropology, like many disciplines, is evolutionarily based. Biology is evolutionarily based. Chemistry is very much a natural science that's based on ideas of natural science, evolutionarily based. So it's not to say, I think we're a little hesitant in Adventist education to delve too deeply into fields that might lean a bit toward that, but we really already are, in that we study a lot in biology. We study microbiology, absolutely evolutionarily based. My youngest sister is a microbiologist at England. It's very, very important to have believing people in fields where there aren't many people asking questions from a believer's perspective. And I think another difference for me I find in Adventism is a bit of this critical approach. In my experience, now this is limited, so I'll be very curious to know what your experiences have been. But my experience was, I was born and raised in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. My mom is both of my parents are very strong Adventists. My dad's an elder in the church. My mom's a leader as well, but very hesitant to critique anything at all of the church, and also not very politically active. That was not, not a way that they were, thought to be. That really, the Lord's got everything, and you just be good and keep your mind on holy things, and the Lord will take care of the rest. And there's some really good research that's coming out here at Andrews, but in other places as well, that address being a bit more engaged in communities beyond our idea of Adventism. To say that when I think when we're called to do justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly, that means not only with our families and in our church communities, but also in communities that are beyond what we would consider kind of the bounds of church. And I think that we have a moral and ethical responsibility to be more engaged, to be engaged more broadly. And so I think as a difference between secular approaches to anthropology and a Christian approach or a believer's approach, and Christian is a very, very broad term as well. Christian means lots of things. So for me, I to say a Seventh-day Adventist believer, I think for me, for my approach, which may be different than other Adventist approaches, for me that approach, and that is different from the secular approach, is that is not less of a focus in terms of understanding what the ways that evolutionarily human histories have been thought about, but there's definitely to recognize the absolutely other possibilities. And I'm a creationist, an old Earth, young life creationist. So absolutely bringing that to ideas of human culture and human history. But also, I think what anthropology can then also bring to Adventism is also exactly the kind of conversations we're having. There are conversations that are somehow uncomfortable, that I think because we don't like to rock the boat, or there's difficult conversations. Conversations with race are difficult. This was a conversation in the Bible that was difficult. I mean, when the widows come to the apostles very early there in Acts, we talk about the Acts 2 church. It's all beautiful, and then we have this ethnic tension that happens immediately that we never even frame as an ethnic tension, where the Greek widows are saying, "Hey, we're not getting our share of the bread," and the Hebrew widows are, they're like, "I don't know, we're getting what we need." And right away at the very beginning, there's this tension, there's this inequality that's based in ethnicity that the church takes very, very seriously. They don't say, "Oh, well, we'll just appoint some deaconesses and they'll manage potluck," but they appoint men who are wise and who have authority and standing to deal with this power problem based in ethnicity. But we have a hard time talking about race in the church and ethnic tensions. We have a hard time talking about gender, whether we're talking about masculinities or femininities or LGBTQ identities. And we're having a hard time talking about that in the church. We have a hard time talking about power in the church. And I think that the social sciences have a lot to give, have a lot to offer in terms of facilitating what are some really necessary conversations for healing and for growth and for the greater strength of community among ourselves as fellow human beings, but also our relationship with God. And God is not afraid of these conversations. He made us. He knows. He is already aware of all these conversations. So he would probably like for us to just go ahead and sit down and have a little talk about it with them.
So we've talked a lot about the anthropologist aspects of the church life, which I find is very interesting to me in Adventism. It seems very much still like to me when you are like most of the Adventist experience I have. This has only changed in the last church I've been to, where you have a little bit more look into the private life of others. But the two Adventist churches were like I've been to were like that was really a mixed bag of experience. And my experience was in the way that, you got to know the church version of the person you met at church and at the social interaction that were at church. And otherwise, there was rather a very shallow approach of getting to know each other, the way you share your spiritual burdens and everything, the way to connect. Something that I figured out during that time where I got really frustrated with church was at work. They caught up that much that you felt more accepted there. You felt like that ethic that you felt the ethic that you learned at or that you applied at work was encouraged and it was developed. You were challenged as well in a positive way to have that ethic, not just in your workplace, but you also connect with your work colleagues on a more deeper level. And I think where at the moment, this work, for example, as part of the world, would you say that there is a huge catch-up potential for the way we handle power as well in church? Because work is usually most about power, but the work I've been to, it has felt more than, although it's about power, it has empowered me more than church could ever do. Setting aside Jesus himself, like I'm not gonna lie, the thing that carried me through that, I would say, like, yeah, that was some painful years of church. It was Jesus who carried me to that, but what I felt at church was rather like, yeah, you have to climb the ladder of holiness to be something at this church. This is the way I perceive the power at those churches. Whereas at work, I was like, yeah, you're not the most expert in your field, but, we give you the opportunities to develop, to increase your knowledge, to you can be something. And would you say there's a big catching up to do, because that the world through that empowerment just is so much more appealing than church environment? How would you, what's your aspect on like how the way of using power has changed in the workplace and maybe also in social clubs in comparison to the church environment, where change is a little bit more on the slow side?
Yeah, I think as Seventh-day Adventists, we're pretty good at being friendly, but really often we don't actually want to be friends. And there's really a difference. There's a profound difference. It's very nice to say good morning. It's nice to smile. It's nice to be pleasant to each other. We should absolutely be pleasant to each other. But that's a very, very different thing than being friends, than being in a deep kind of friendship, or even whether it's a kind of a personal intimacy of friendship, like your best friend or your friend that you've known all your life, or whether it's just a friend who knows the realities of your life. Like, I'm always kind of relieved the first time a friend comes over and finds the house a mess. Like, I try to keep it pretty clean, but when somebody comes over, or like my hair is straight, like it is actually really straight. So if my hair it looks like this, it's because I curled it, and it looks quite a bit different when it's straight. So the first time my friends see me and they're like, oh yeah, I guess that's how she looks up when she gets up in the morning. It's always a little bit of a relief to be like, okay, this is the moment of truth, right? And so we have these relationships that are like that, and often it feels like, and I think this is a question of power, right? We are always caught in this, and this is not new. It's not new. This is the disciples are doing this. Who's the greatest? Who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom? Who's going to get to sit next to our Lord? And we find ourselves doing this in church, and we're caught between this prideful place of being like, "Whew, I think I'm doing okay today. I got it all together," or this place of shame and this place of, maybe somebody says something, or maybe I look in the mirror and all of a sudden I realize, oh, I thought I looked, okay. It turns out the back of me was covered with dog hair, and I thought I was doing all right. Now it turns out, no, I actually was a mess this morning. So we're always kind of caught in this place, and somehow the power that we need is the power where God says to us, I love you, and you can love each other, and you can be in this ongoing relationship. As I've been looking at God and trying to figure out, like, what is going on with power? What is the social organization of heaven? Anthropologists study social organization and relationships of power, the kind of research that I do. And like, what does that look like in heaven? Heaven seems to be hierarchical. We have an almighty God, a creator God, and all other creatures are created. And we have this idea of, when the apostles are, throwing themselves at the feet of angels, we have the story of John, and they're like, oh, no, don't do that. Don't do that. We are fellow, but clearly we're different from each other. How does this work? And so, and we know there's some good research in behavioral economics, some really good research in psychology as well. They've done functional MRIs that shows that as you get more advanced in class, as you get more advanced in position and power in your work, that the parts of our brain that work on empathy actually get smaller. That with functional MRI, people who are in positions of power, the parts of their brain, when you do functional MRIs and they ask them questions that have to do with empathy and care for someone else, those parts of their brain just don't light up as much. And so it's like, how is this happening? That as we become more advanced in our fields, as we become more in positions of leadership, and that we're actually less able somehow, even through our own neurophysiology, to be less empathetic, less kind, less generous with each other, And how does God keep this from happening? How does this not happen to him? Is this just a brokenness of humanity? But what happens with what I see, and this is a thought, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, because this is like a theory in motion that I'm just kind of working on. And it's this idea that there's this undulation, and this is present really in nature too, right? If we have waveforms, and so there's this undulation that's very present in the natural world, and we have this undulation of power that happens in the scriptures, where we have a God, a creator God, who calls all into existence, and then he absolutely lets us go. He lets us free to choose. You can love me or you can walk away. And we have a God who's almighty and all powerful, and then he lays all that down and becomes a servant and washes our feet and becomes a human, and who gets sick probably sometimes, or who doesn't always, it gets tired, and who has to experience these ups and downs. And so it makes me think, I'm hoping this is maybe some hope for myself, that, you know, as I would love to, you know, be good at my job and be able to be in amazing forums where I'm talking to phenomenal thinkers like you guys, and like, what an amazing, lovely thing. How do I keep this part of my brain still really empathetic and kind toward the people around me? And I think the answer might be that nursing is actually, it provides me a little bit of the answer to that, that there's some volunteering that maybe needs to happen. I worked in the emergency department. That was my favorite place in the hospital. I took care of a lot of people who were homeless. I took a lot of care of a lot of people who were drunk or who were high. I cleaned up a lot of vomit, a lot of dirty faces. And, you know, you have to be careful with homeless people. They a lot of times store their belonging in their socks. And if you try to like take their shoes and socks off and wash their feet or something, they'll come up swinging sometimes because they think you're trying to rob them. But, you know, but trying to figure out, you know, how do I help this person with bed bugs, you know, and that somehow in that act of service, that I think that maybe that's the key to that, you know, if we take on the responsibility that God calls us to be the people that he calls us to understand ourselves as children of God, to understand that he's given us new hearts, that he puts us in positions of leadership, in positions of power, even just to influence the lives. I can influence the life of my dog. I can cause my dog to have a good day or to be abused, to influence the lives of our friends. Even that is incredibly powerful. And God calls us to incredible positions of power, and that we can encourage each other and strengthen each other, or we can make each other feel like nothing, feel like we don't matter. This is an incredibly powerful thing. God calls us to this, but also calls us to be of service, also calls us, and that this relationship of power with each other, that sometimes God calls us to be high. We're called to sit at his side. We're called to lead, to guide. He values us. He died for us. He values our hearts. Our lives are meaningful. And so this is a very powerful thing. And then as this gets poured out, then it allows this undulation of power that keeps us from being proud, that keeps us from being oppressive and abusive, that allows us to see the ways in which our privilege blinds us to the needs of those around us, and allows us to continue to be empathetic, and then allows us to create structures in the church or structures in schools or organizational structures that are much more able to empower growth, empower community, empower, you know, a use of power that brings life rather than that brings oppression and brings pain. So I think there's an undulation there of power, and I think I've also wandered a fair bit from your original question. So if there's some spot that I've missed that you want me to come back to, go for it. But I think that's where I am.
And thank you for sharing that. I was thinking that in society we handle this concept of soft power and hard power, and we see that develop in our communities, in our world, since ever, right? We always have been using hard power and soft power, meaning that hard power is when you enforce something by might, by strength, by war, by economics influence and whatnot, right? To coerce people to do your will. That's hard power. And soft power, then it is what we know is part of politics, you know, try to use rhetoric, to use reason to influence each other better. Now, in our Christian communities, you as an anthropologist, have you ever found any research in how this power play takes place into our community? And if it's happening, is it healthy? Should we get rid of the? Probably my question would be, then how could we use hard power in a good way, or it should be everything let leave for soft power in our community, in a Christian community?
These are complex questions, and they're different in different contexts, right? Because when we talk about, so let me, I want to make sure that I address both parts of that. So the idea of hard power and soft power, and then community. And when should we use those? So with hard power and soft power, those are different ways of kind of conceptualizing by force or by more gentle means, or by political means or social means. And in both of those, this takes us back to the idea of agency and free will. Whether you're using hard power or soft power, if it's coercive, this is always a kind of oppression. This is always a kind of violence. Foucault would say that that's a kind of violence. And I think that spiritually and biblically, we could address that as well, right? Whether God is saying, I'm never going to force you to love me, or whether he's saying, I'm going to make it impossible for you not to love me. In those ways, we both are, there's no agency. And whether we look at that from a negative point, whether Satan takes us down by making us, we're in a gang and involved with, drugs and, whatever else, what that feels like, or whether, we're quietly led to the, down the dark road by things much more subtle, by pride, or, things that are just much more gentler, in any case, they're both manipulative, they're both coercive, they both take us ways that aren't in our own best interest. So when you're talking about hard power or soft power, you have to think about agency and in what ways does the individual or does the group able to move in the direction that benefits them, or in the directions that they want to go, or the directions that are helpful to them. So I can very softly and gently talk my 2-year-old granddaughter into going for a nap, even though she does not want to go for a nap. Or I can force her to lay in her bed and tell her she has to go for a nap. But in either of those cases, like, it may feel like a hard or soft kind of power, that still my will prevails. But if she's really tired and she brings me her blanket and she brings me her bottle, and I'm like, oh, she wants to lay down and she just needs to snuggle, and then I can take her into my arms. I want her to take a nap. She wants to take a nap. And then, then rather than being this hard power of me saying my will is going to prevail on you, you are taking a nap. Now she also wants. So when we talk about this, I think politically, the idea of is soft power a hard power? Does it promote the interest of the people? We like democracies because we believe that democracies promote the best interest of the people. But if a democracy is organized in such a way that the will of the people still doesn't prevail at all, then it's a soft kind of power that's oppressive, right? Because if there are still people being marginalized who their voices aren't able to be heard, even or especially if we have a form of government that purports or that says it listens to everyone and tries to take everyone's voice into account, and then is structured in such a way that certain groups, whole groups, are purposely excluded, then this is a very soft kind of very oppressive power. So when we talk about hard power and soft power, we're talking about those mechanisms. Are you drawing someone along softly, or are you enforcing it? But that can be good or bad depending on whether or not you're moving in the direction of autonomy or of agency, or is this the direction that someone wants to go? And I guess the reason I'm teasing apart those definitions a little bit is to say that because God uses them. There are times we know in the Bible that there are times when God uses hard power. The flood is a hard power moment, right? Or the end time events that we're talking, those are hard power moments, right? And that when he says the day will come when the separation of the sheep and go to judgment, that's a hard power. And yet we see all through the Gospels and all through the Bible that God is wooing us, like he's wanting us to come to him. He's saying, I love you, I forgive you, I'm trying to make everything possible for you to love me and to be saved. And that's very much a soft power. But in the end, I think when it comes to agency, it's this recognition that I think there's a verse from a song, but all I was trying to do is, I won't be able to give the name of the artist, but anyway, all I was trying to do was save my own skin. But so were you. And if we get to the point where we're like, oh wait, I need God, and God's like, yes, you do. I've been trying to tell you. Then what we want, our agency, our will, our desire for what's best in our lives, He's like, yes, that's exactly what I want for you. And then our will becomes like what we need and what we want is aligned with what He needs and what He wants. And so then, then there's this better alignment of power to where He can help us and we can like give ourselves to Him, and whatever strength or ability or gifts that He gives to us then can also be used, and it becomes a cooperative kind of power that works differently. And so then in the forms of hard power, so we think of hard power as being a problem when it's oppressive, when it's keeping us from doing the things that we need to do or want to do. If a thief broke into our house and they had me by the neck like this, and they were standing like this, and all of a sudden my husband came in and he had a knife in his hand, or he was really big and strong, and he said to whoever had me by the neck, you're not going to be able to do that anymore, and by hard power pulled that person off of me. I wouldn't think that was oppressive. I would think that that form of hard power was liberation. I would think that that was my freedom. He had given me back my life through the use of that hard power, because He came in and definitively stopped that thing that was a threat to me. And I think in those ways, when we can view the hard power of God in those ways, we can recognize that as our salvation. That when God comes in those hard power ways, particularly when we think of the judgment, I mean, we're sometimes afraid of judgment. That's fire and brimstone. Nobody likes to think of those parts because it feels like the hard power of God in terrible ways, but we have to remember that we're the ones being held by the neck. And He comes in definitively to take our enemy off of us and to liberate us, to give us freedom and to give us life. And I think that as a church, when we use hard power, if we're using it to liberate, if we're using it to give freedom, if we're using it to give life, if we're using it so that then people can say, oh my goodness, I can breathe now. I can have a glimpse of God that's better than it was before. I can engage in community in ways that I never could before, because my marginalizations are recognized, because the things I've suffered have been recognized, and this enemy has been taken off of my neck. Then hard power is freedom. It's a good, right? It's not oppressive. So it depends on how we.
Dr. Hatfield, I've been trying to define power for myself and how I can relate it to people. So this question really comes from the struggle that I'm going to write down in this conversation. So would you differentiate power and responsibility? And how would we be as individuals, especially as Christians, if we were either power-driven or purpose-driven? Would you differentiate that again? And also in your conversation, if we realize that we are dependent on God, His love, and that's why we are existing here, would our concept of power change rather than being independent, self-sufficient, and being puffed up with all that? So would our concept of power change in all of these aspects?
Yeah, that's a beautiful question. Thank you. So 2 questions. I'm going to start with the second one first. Yeah, absolutely. That the part where I'm warm, my body is producing heat. That is an energy that I don't entirely understand. I mean, I have had chemistry classes. I understand that this is metabolism and this is how heat is produced. That there's a biological, physical, chemical nature of that. But there's energy in the universe that originates from places that I don't know and don't understand. And I am alive. I came into this life not of my own will. And when it comes time for me to die and leave, that may not be of my own will either. We occupy this life and this body through very little choice of our own. And it's an incredible gift. It's an incredible gift. And not only are we dependent on God for the life that we have, but we're dependent on each other. I'm dependent on my children who love me and care for me, my husband who not only helps to provide, but who is who is, so much companionship and friendship and support and depth of affection and tenderness there. We're dependent on the people who grow our food and the people who plant it. I'm dependent on the person who takes away the trash and who helps to maintain the sewers. We are interrelated and dependent on each other all the time. And the people who work in the CEO offices of the high-rise building are utterly dependent on that night shift worker who comes in and vacuums their floor and keeps the dust out of their computers and makes their offices look nice so they can have that power meeting in the morning. If it wasn't for that, their work wouldn't be able to happen. And the people at the electric company and the people who built their buildings, we are utterly dependent on each other all the time. We refuse to recognize often these relationships of care and community and responsibility that we're embedded in, but absolutely we are. So yes, I think we absolutely need to be more mindful, not only of our utter dependence on God, which of course is infinite, but he designed that not only would we be utterly dependent on him, but that we would be embedded in these other relationships and in relationship also with the planet, these other relationships that we're dependent on. So I think that takes us back to your first question, which is the relationship between power and responsibility and purpose. And those are really three different things as well, right? In the Marvel movies or in the Spider-Man, there's a famous quote that gets repeated all the time. Great power comes great responsibility. And can you have power without responsibility? You can manage power irresponsibly, or if you have power, how can you avoid being responsible? And this is an ethical question that comes before God, right? If he's all powerful, then surely he's also responsible for the mess that's going on down here. So how do we think about God's power in terms of his responsibility? How do we understand our own power and our own responsibility? And in what ways are we responsible? What is the autonomy that he's given us? And in what ways are those enmeshed and embedded? And in what ways is he moving in ways that we don't even understand? Absolutely. Power and responsibility. They're not the same thing, but they are related to each other. So yes, when you have power, you have responsibility. How do you manage that? And if you're a person in power, then if there's a problem, then part of that is being responsible, right? And saying that, I'm in a position of privilege. As a white person, as a white woman in the United States, there's power and there's privilege in that. So in what ways am I then responsible for the people who are don't have those same privileges? I have a responsibility to be aware of, the things that they may experience that I'm not experiencing because I'm just in that position. I work at a university. But that's a privileged position. So with that power comes a responsibility to be attentive to the needs of the people around me. And then purpose, I think purpose is a different thing because purpose is a little bit like power in that there can be high and holy purposes, and there can also be malevolent purposes. So by purpose, a purpose kind of I'm assuming that you mean that we're attentive and that we're intentional always in how we're using power and responsibility. I think as Adventists, I'm not sure, you can tell me what you think about this, but I think that we often very much think about this relationship with God. So my relationship, it's me and my relationship with God, and then how I interact with the people around me is then, that I can take that back. Oh God, I didn't say this ugly thing that I could have said to my neighbor. So are we good now? Is that good between you and me? Or, look, I did this thing with my student that was maybe a little shady. I guess I'm gonna have to straighten that out. It's always, and I think that we visualize our purpose outside of community. We visualize our purpose as being somehow about us. And I've been to India, but I'm not as familiar with how culturally it's arranged. In the United States, it's very individualistic, Western ideas. It's about the individual, my own relationship with God, my own personal attainments, and less and my own identity, and less as my identity is being embedded in the community. So I think that often when I talk about community, it's from a Western perspective as a corrective to that, to say that this very individualistic way of envisioning ourselves is probably not biblical, probably not the way the community of heaven really works, and is probably very much influenced by Western thought, and in ways that I need to remedy in my own life, but also in around me. So I think when we think about purpose-driven, what is my purpose as an individual, and my purpose is my relationship with God, And what is our purpose as a community? How do we have shared purposes, not only shared purposes as a church community, but also shared purposes with our local communities? And how does the purposes of this church help to benefit the shared goals of my neighborhood or my town that I'm in? And how do we think of ourselves as more broadly embedded in community? I don't know if is that more what you were thinking, or were you aiming a little different direction?
That answers my question.
I would like to circle back to the concept that power is always present, that power dynamics are always present. And, as I hear you talk about it, I'm thinking of it from my own perspective, my own life experience, way of experiencing life as an ADHD person, because I function in high gear versus low gear. So it's either hyper focus or low focus. And that informs my response to stimuli around me, including the dynamics, the relational dynamics that I'm experiencing with different people, right? Any kind of context. And of course, for a neurotypical person, that may be more constant, but either way, what you're suggesting is that we always are in a power dynamic, and that the best way to engage in that is to be aware. And so part of my question then would be, maybe it's a two-part question: how can we become more aware? And I'm raising that issue specifically from my perspective of slow response versus fast response to engaging in power dynamics, to understanding power dynamics. How do we become more aware of that in a way that is helpful to engage in the power dynamics? And also, how do we then engage in power dynamics in a way that we neither power over somebody, but nor do we accept being powered over? If you have any insights, I would really appreciate that.
I am utterly indebted all the time to people who were in difficult positions and who shouldn't have had to say, can you not see that this is really difficult? Can you not see that my experiences as a Black person in the United States are different from yours? Can you not see that my experience in Adventism are different than yours? Can you not see that my experience as a single person are different than yours? And it takes that courage, it takes that visibility, it takes that presence for someone, for these differences. They're not always automatically recognizable. To say, oh wow, I think this person may have a very different experience than I do, or this person may be, this may be very difficult for them. And so very often, and anthropologically, this is a tenet of anthropology, that to learn about someone else's experiences, you have to find out from them. What is your experience? Adelina, what is your experience like as an ADHD person? How is this feeling to you? I mean, I may walk into this room and it may feel like this to me, but depending on how your day is going, you may feel very differently. And once I begin to have an awareness of how you are perceiving it, then I can have a better idea of how I can respond in such a way. And this is where purpose comes in, right? Because it needs to be important that I want you to feel valued. I want your input to be valued. I want who you are as a person to be valued. I want your voice to be heard. But it's very possible. And we've all had people who walk into a room and they see a weakness or they see a weak spot and they just lean into that to go ahead and take advantage. So it does come to purpose, right? But when our purposes are to value each other, to build relationship with each other, now when I know that maybe your day is going like this, or maybe you're perceiving it very differently than I am, then I can know how to respond differently in a way that helps to build a cooperative dynamic that's helpful to us. So very often it requires that we listen to each other, that we hear each other, that we create spaces for each other's words, to know that power is present, and to be aware that we have the ability to be very hard on each other. We have the ability to create policies, to create institutions. We have even if you guys have friends, whether or not you have children, or to say, well, we're going to make this rule in our house, or I'm going to make this rule in my friendship, or I'm going to make this rule for our book club, or whatever it is. We can create more informal or formal policies that marginalize people, or that are forms of power. against each other. And so those are the ways that power is always present. So then, we have to listen to each other. We have to create spaces to listen to each other and to hear each other. And when someone says, well, actually, what I meant was this, or for me to say, did I hear you correctly? Or am I understanding that right? Or I'm sorry, I was wrong, or I really misunderstood and I hurt you, and I didn't mean for that to happen. But it requires some honesty, and it requires vulnerability, and it means that it means incredible humility. Very often in a relationship, we get it wrong. We misunderstand each other. I may come. This is Walt as an optimist, right? I'm pretty sunny most days, so I can come bouncing into a room, and I'm pretty good. The day's going pretty well. That is not other people's experience, and it can feel like they can feel like, man, what's happening in my life is not being valued because this sunny bright person who just bounced in, which of course could be stuff that happens in my life too, but this sunny person who just bounced in, now we've all got to pretend we're happy because Stacie just showed up. This is a way that we marginalize each other. For me to say, no, I need to to kind of get myself managed a little bit when I come into a group of people and say, everybody's experience of this day and at this moment is different, and we want to value each other. And sometimes I need to say, I'm sorry. I was caught up in my own thing, and I wasn't paying attention, and I hurt you. I'm really sorry. And that's a powerful thing too.
Going back to the idea of power structures and systemic power abuse, this is something that is difficult for people to understand. I don't feel like I really understood it until very recently, when I put it very simply in the sense of systemic power abuse is when the problem is in the system, but is not recognized as the locus of the problem is not recognized as being in the system, but in a person who is maybe part of the system, who doesn't fit that kind of system. And I relate that again to the neurotypical versus neurodivergent way of thinking and doing things, because typically power structures, workplace, education systems are organized around neurotypical way of thinking. And it's considered something normal because it is the norm. I disagree with that very narrow concept of norm, but that's another story. So there's just one perspective of looking at it. There are many perspectives of looking at different kinds of power structures and in reference to different aspects of individual and communal life. But that's just the way I understand it personally now, is locating the problem in the person, in the individual versus in the system. Have you wrestled with this question of systemic power, and do you have any insights on that as a way to conclude the conversation?
From a theory perspective, I would have to find an endnote and throw it up in the chat or something, but there is an article, a foundational article on the concept of structural violence by Juan. And it's an article that's based in peacemaking and peace studies. Galton has done a tremendous amount of work in peace studies. But in order to address peace and peace studies, he said we have to really understand violence. And he talks about this idea of violence that happens between two people, and how do we even define violence? And he defines violence. Galton defines violence as anything that prevents the full flourishing of an individual. So whether or an individual group. So whether I personally come and bump you on the head and do this violence against you, and that causes you not to flourish, that's a kind of violence. But when we see individuals who are not flourishing, when we see groups that are not flourishing, we know that some sort of violence has taken place, according to Galton's theory, I think it's a very helpful theory. So then when we can say, how do we understand violence? Well, we can't point to a specific person. Like there's violence in the structure. And part of the structural violence is it says, well, the problem, rather than I think the kind of structural violence that you're talking about is where the structure just doesn't recognize that the structure is designed to meet the needs of a particular group of people, and anybody who isn't that particular group of people just falls out of the system. Just their needs just don't get met because the system isn't designed to help them or to facilitate them, or isn't designed for their use. So this is structural violence, absolutely. And part of that violence is then it casts the blame, rather than casting the blame on the structure, it casts the blame on the individual. where the violence is actually in the system or in the structural violence rather than in the individual's experience in the violence. So on Galton's article, particularly the first couple of pages, Johan Galton is very helpful for looking at how do we think about structural violence and how do we think about these systems that we make. And whether or not the problem is with the individual or whether the problem is with the structure. And this is Western thought again, very US, but also Western thought is that the problem is always in the individual. Oh, well, you're an individual, you should be able to fix this, or you should be able to adapt to the system, or sure, there are all these structural problems, but this one person managed to survive, so every should be able to survive. It's nonsense, of course. It's structural violence, but it's a societal way of thinking, cultural way of thinking that the problem is in the individual, and that's a form of violence. Something else that I would add, and that is when we talk about power, we often think of power almost a little bit like we think of electricity, like it's just out there somewhere. Like power is just out there, or this thing between us, so that power between two people. Well, it's just this energy, or this this aura, or this almost like static electricity compared to like lightning. This kind of power is just out there. But and in some ways that's kind of true. It's abstract and we conceptualize it, but power has everyday manifestations. There are everyday ways in which it is enacted and reinforced and maintained. And so when we begin to look at those ways in which power is enacted, maintained, enforced every day, then we can say, well, if there's a problem in the structure, that structure isn't static. It's not in stone. We could talk about the church, or we could talk about education, we could talk about healthcare systems, we could talk about governments. We can say, the problem with managing disability in the United States, and the problem that so many people are not getting their needs met, is because of the system. This system can be changed. There are people who are writing these policies. There are people who are approving projects. There are people who are, this system is being maintained, it's being enacted, it's moving all the time. So if it is, then we can change it. And when I talked for just a moment about white supremacy as a system of power, that's not just a thing that's out there. That is a system of power differential that is maintained in the United States through everyday ways of speaking, everyday ways of the media bringing certain things to the top, everyday ways that law enforcement either arrests or stares longer at one person than the other. It has to do with the distance that we give each other when we pass on the sidewalk. There are everyday, real, tangible ways that power is enacted and maintained, and forms of power are created. And so it's not just something abstract that's out there. It's also something that's everyday in our everyday actions, our everyday interactions. And so even as we're having this conversation, as you think about the next words that you say to the person you talk to, the next thing you set on the table, the next thing you do can be a form of power that changes the oppressive structures or the oppressive interactions that we've been engaging in. The way you choose to walk down the street, the person you look at, the person you stop to talk with a little longer, or the person you let pass by without a glance. These are all interactions that convey power. And so in that way, we can change the structures that are around us. We can enact in it all the time. And this is what's hopeful spiritually as well. That as the Holy Spirit is in us, as we're being changed, as we have new hearts, as God says, look, I'm going to give you a new heart and a new mind, and it's going to blow your mind. Like, I have not seen, ear have not heard, neither have entered into the heart of man. Like, I'm going to take you places you could not even have imagined. You're going to be able to love the people around you. There are things that are going to emerge out of the relationships and out of communities that you create that you could not even have fathomed. It's going to blow your mind how powerful I'm going to be in you in ways that bring life, and in ways that bring hope, and in ways that happen through everyday ways of being and interacting.
Many thanks, Stacie, for the conversation. I absolutely love it. I find it interesting. I find it very informative and also formative. And I find it very empowering. So I really appreciate you being able to offer us all of that through your insights and comments and listening to our questions and engaging with them. Many, many thanks for that. Let's share some takeaways before we conclude the discussion.
Sure, I have two main takeaways. One of them is that power and influence is around us and within us. All of us have some level of power and influence, and there is a need for us to be aware of that, to make a good use of that influence. And the second takeaway that I have is I always thought of hard power as something bad, or it was not present in God's character. But now seeing through this conversation that hard power used in a way to bring liberation, to bring good things, it's a good thing to do. And you know, it makes me also to be aware of what level of hard power do I have around me that I can bring or use for good. So that's definitely a takeaway that I have from this conversation. And thank you so much for answering all of our questions. And I appreciate the time you took to go in depth in each one of them.
Like Juan said, I also became a little more conscious that all of us live in a dynamic of power. And I myself am not a very assertive person, but now I've become more aware that we do have a certain amount of power and influence, and it is a responsibility to exercise it, you know, well. Also that in this conversation, I've become aware that we are codependent on each other as well as God. And I think that kind of shapes my concept of power, in a sense that we all, you know, are inclusive in this. Also, sometimes we can't make big changes in the system of power we live in or that surrounds us. But like you suggested, it gives us hope that we can make those small differences in our small deeds. It might not be something huge or big, but it might make a difference to one person who's struggling with that issue or something. So that makes us more aware of people around us and how we can be agents of change in this power struggle.
I'd like to say thank you for the discussion today. There has been a lot to take in, and I like that you started off with a nice definition of thinking of community as being in the process of relationship that we can build and maintain in an ongoing process, and it becomes a more organic form of community. The idea that the more powerful we become, the less empathetic we become is quite a scary idea. And I think that's a big takeaway that we have in this discussion, that, you know, each of us, wherever we are, we can make that difference. Like Beersheba said, even in small amounts, but it is effective. And to remember that even though power is always present, the Bible shows us, you know, that God, despite his powerful being, he came down to our level. And power can be a good thing too.
Thank you very much for all the input that we could enjoy today. And it has been a lot of things to take in as well. Especially what stood out of me is, you know, regardless of what you think, you know, sometimes when we hear something from somebody talking from, it's like somebody talks from the pulpit and tells like, oh yeah, everybody's a preacher. And you're just sitting in the pew and like, oh yeah, no, I'm just good. Regardless of whether you want it or not, you are working in a power dynamic and being aware of that. And also the worst part of it is that you have to be aware, what part of the power dynamic are you in? Are you more powerful or not? Because often we are more powerful than we think we are. And even as a person of color, being born in the West and being born in Germany, that just, puts me at the top, like 3 or 5% of wealthiest people on the planet. And, just to take that into account and how that shapes the view, this constructive view that, even if you have your own opinion and that's your way of directing power, there's a very different way of that. And the way then as well, the more responsibilities you have, the more you become reluctant to empathize with people. I think those two aspects, they are like sort of they are often not talked about, but they are extremely important to be aware of when you want to put this, let's call it power play, for good use, and to make others feel power in a good way and not have gain this abusive perspective of power, this harsh one, which you don't want to experience, the one which you don't need when you occasionally need a little bit of tough love. And I think this arises with second challenge of me for, like, that's one of the challenges for me, having all this awareness, becoming more aware of what is my position of power in my current environment, and what are the options, like becoming more clear of the options. I think that's a challenge of that. And I encourage everyone, like, become aware, like, how powerful are you in their social interactions you're taking part of, because sometimes it's more than you think and you just overshoot, or sometimes you're supposed to speak up in a place where you should have, and then you didn't, and you missed out big time. And I think, thank you very much for all the massive input of today.
Wonderful. I resonate with all of that fully. I think my takeaway is actually, and this is the first time it's happened in the program, but I think it's less conceptual and more of a feeling, that I feel like I need to really slow down, because everything you talked about, I feel like I want to slow down enough to be able to observe that in my community and the way I interact with people and the way they interact with me, and that way negotiate those power plays in their own context and time in the moment. And I'm aware that in order to slow down, and I've done that intuitively quite a bit more lately than before, but I feel like I need to do it more. And I'm aware that that takes away from other things on my schedule, and from the expectations that the society puts on me. But it just seems that it's a priority that emerges from this conversation that I'm walking away with, challenged and hopeful of what it would bring, actually. So thank you very, very much for that, instilling that in me. Let's conclude the conversation with a final word from you, Stacie, for the group, but also specifically for our viewers and our listeners.
I want to thank each of you for your questions and for your thoughtfulness and for being here. And I'm really encouraged that the greatest power in the universe is also a power who declares himself to be love and declares himself to be justice and mercy, because so often that's not the power that we see. And I wish that more often that was the power that even myself, as in the small ways that I move through my day, how often are they really motivated by love and by mercy and by an appreciation for the incredible freedom, the incredible grace that's been shown to me. And so as we conceptualize power and conceptualize God's power, I think the sun rose this morning as quietly as can be and shone light on the whole planet. And that is the kind of power that so often our God is, so gentle and yet so utterly pervasive and powerful. And I'm so grateful, because that shows us so much about who God is as a being who is all powerful and yet who invites us into relationship with him, and who utterly releases us as well from the grips of his power, if that's what we want. And that tells us a lot.
A heartfelt thank you to our special guests and to the student panelists for their thoughtful engagement. On behalf of our sponsor, the Adventist Theological Society, and on behalf of the Life with God team, I would like to also thank our viewers and our listeners for being here. We hope that you have learned some new and helpful insights that will transform you more into the likeness of God and empower you to become a better human being. As you can see, these conversations bring together young adults and scholars who have dedicated their lives to advancing our understanding of God, of the Bible, and of the complex human personhood. It is a unique opportunity for you to get to know these committed servant leaders and learn from them as they interact with students from around the world. If you would like to support this podcast, you can do so with your presence, your comments, your prayers, and by sharing the program. If you're so inclined, you can also extend your financial support by donating to the Adventist Theological Society. To do so, go to www.atsjats.org/resources and find the Donate Now button. Make sure you also subscribe to the Adventist Theological Society YouTube channel, where you will find past and ongoing seasons. Thank you again, and I hope that you will join us next time as well.